Well, 6.2 is out and it has brought a variety of great content, including the new and shiny island sanctuary. And it is something that interests you, so naturally you want to know as much as you can before you get into it. Well, here is the guide for you. Starting out, the first thing you have to do is actually unlock your island sanctuary. You do this in Old Charlian, meaning you do actually have to reach Endwalker. But once you do reach Old Charlian, it is simple as talking to this clueless crier who will trigger a cutscene with Tatarda, who will then send you to Lower Nova Scotia, where you will unlock your island sanctuary. Once you get to the island, the game is basically going to guide you through the first few ranks, but there's actually a big mistake you can make really early on. One of the first tasks the game will have you do is to craft a cozy cabin. This is going to give you access to the island's merchants that use the currency that the game has been giving you. Now, your immediate thought's probably going to be to go buy the minion or the new glams that people really like, but the problem is this currency is also used to expand your island. So if you use too much of it too quickly, then you're not going to be able to buy new facilities or expand your pastures and farms. So as much as it might suck, hold off on buying your new glamours. You'll get a lot more of the currency later on once you've developed your island. A key aspect of being successful with your island is gathering, as a majority of your progression is going to be locked behind having specific resources. Now obviously for many of these resources, you're not going to know where they are, and even if you do, you might not be gathering them in the most efficient way. Now the first thing you really need to know about gathering is that for a resource to respawn, you have to have gathered 10 others. Because of this, the best way to gather resources is to find a cluster of different resources that you actually want to gather. The best example I can give of this is with the island palms, as they're one of the first resources the game has you acquire. Now there's only about 5 or 6 trees in this area. However, there's also a lot of limestone, which you're going to need a lot of. So instead of just trying to farm the trees, what you do is you get the trees and the limestone. By the time you get the last tree, the first one is respawned, and then you just repeat the cycle. Another useful example of this is with copper ore and vines. Further down the river from the pine, you'll find a bunch of sugarcane. Each one of these sugarcane is going to give you a vine. But a little further down to the left, you're also going to find some copper ore, about 5. These are both resources that you're going to need in abundance. So like the example that I just gave with the palm wood, you can gather all the sugarcane, go to the copper, and then go back to the sugarcane. Doing this will net you a large amount of vines and copper ore in a short amount of time, whereas if you were to try to gather that copper by itself, it wouldn't be nearly successful. And on the other river, you have a great source of sticks and clay. After you acquire the shovel, you can gather these dirt piles for clay. And there's also about 4 or 5 skinny trees around this area which you can use to gather sticks. Now if you do both these river spots, you'll be able to make nets rather easily. Speaking of nets, let's move on to our next point, which is pastures and catching animals. Now one thing to know about animals is that the rewards aren't on an individual timer. Instead, they are on a daily timer, meaning each day, all your animals will yield their resources. This means you don't have to worry about gathering resources from an animal before releasing it. The other big thing to know with pastures is rare animals. Now, starting out, you're only going to have the small net, meaning you can only catch small animals. There's going to be things like sheep, squirrels, kobolins, and acapulus. And then there are the rare variants of these animals that only spawn under certain conditions. First rare variant you're probably going to see is the Orny Caracal. This is a black sheep that can be found in this little field here. Next up is the Lemur, and its spawn condition is it has to be 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Eorzean time. It can be found in this little nook over here, right outside the base. Next up is the Star Marmot, which spawns at 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eorzean time, and it can be found on the left side of the north-facing river. Next is the Apocalypse Paradise, which can spawn from 12 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eorzean time on the Pirate Bay beach. Lastly is the Yellow Koblin, which can be found at the top of the mountain during fog. So outside the rare variants, what animal should you be going for? Well, it depends on what you'll be crafting with your workshop and what is the supply and demand. But for now, it's not a bad idea to have a variety of different animals, that way you can start building a surplus of all their different resources. It's also not a terrible idea to get a lot of one animal, that way you have a large surplus of a given resource. You can always release animals and gather new ones if you so choose, so don't stress about it too much. Since I just touched upon it, let's move on to crafting and workshops. Now your workshop is going to be the first building you make outside your cabin, and it's going to be the primary way you generate your currency. How the workshop works is you can have your mammoths craft items to sell. Now these items take real life time to craft, ranging from 4 hours to 8 hours. You can assign the items to be crafted in a schedule up to 24 hours. So for example, you can have a 4 hour, 2 6 hours, and then an 8 hour. Or you can have 6 4 hours, or 4 6 hours. You just have to allot it into that 24-hour period. Now, the items that you're crafting actually affect a decent bit, from category to efficiency bonuses to supply and demand. Now, that's all a bit confusing, but let's go over efficiency first. So you can have your mammoths craft the same item as many times as you want. However, if you craft different items in the same category, you'll get this efficiency bonus. What that means is that items with the tag will be doubled. So instead of making 1 fire sand or 1 potion, they would make 2. Crafting with efficiency bonus also increases your groove, which makes your items overall sell for more. So it's actually a good idea at the beginning of the week to do a bunch of 4-hour efficiency crafts to max out your groove, and then have the later half of your week be spent on the longer, more expensive crafts. Now, what should you be crafting? Well, that depends on your week's supply and demand, which you can see in the review page by going to this chart. Now, this can be a bit overwhelming at first, but it's not that bad once you kind of understand it. Now, there are 4 things on this chart: popularity, supply, demand shift, and predicted demand. Predicted demand you can mostly ignore, as it's simply telling you what next week's popularity is going to be. As for popularity and supply, they are what affects how much your items are going to sell for. You see, if an item is very popular and has non-existent supply, then it's going to sell really well. Whereas if it was low popularity and overabundant, it's not going to sell for that much. Now, popularity is a static stat, meaning it's going to stay the same for the entire week, and it appears that it's the same for everybody. Supply, on the other hand, you actually do have an effect on, as if you craft too many of a given item, you'll see the supply increase. But the supply will also increase without your influence, as that is what the demand shift is telling you. So if you see an item that is skyrocketing in the demand shift, that means that the supply is going to decrease. So if it was, say, sufficient, it might go to non-existent. And the same is true in reverse. If you see an item that has a plummeting demand shift, that means it might go from sufficient to overabundant. Now, to kind of summarize what you want to be doing is, at the beginning of a week, look for an expensive item that has very high popularity and skyrocketing demand shift. You're going to want to end your week with this item, but until then, you want to max out your groove, ideally with some very popular 4-hour crafts. That way, at the end of the week, you'll have a very popular, non-existent, max groove, expensive craft. Moving on from the workshop, let's talk about Granaries, the other building available. Whereas workshops focused on crafting, the Granaries focus on gathering. You're able to send your mammoths out on missions to gather various resources from around the island. However, unlike the player, the mammoths are able to gather rare resources that can only be gotten through these missions. And these rare resources are going to be necessary for the longer, expensive crafts, along with upgrading your buildings. And that's about it for Granaries. Really, the only complexity comes from what rare resource you want to gather. But, covering both Granaries and workshops, a question has to be asked. Because as you progress through your island, you'll gain access to another couple of vacant plots where you can build new buildings. Now, you can either choose to do 3 workshops and 1 granary, or you can do 2 workshops and 2 granaries. Now, the general consensus on this is to go 3-1, because by having access to all 3 of your workshops, you're able to get more of the currency, which you'll need to expand your island. I personally went 2-2 with the justification that the extra rare resources will serve me better in the long run than that small bit of currency. I also believed that if I ran into a roadblock with currency, I could forgo upgrading the farm, as the others give daily rewards. But I'm not an expert, I could be wrong. If you want the extra currency, go for the 3-1. If you want the extra rare resource, go the 2-2. At the end of the day, once you get your farm a high enough level, you'll be able to have all of them. The decision is not a be-all end-all, so don't worry if you feel like you made the wrong one. That's about all you really need to know starting out. All that's left now is to go into your island, start depleting it of resources, and spend hours upon hours waiting for a specific mob to spawn during weather. Have fun!